Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on our Zoom PPL presentation. I'm sorry that we're doing this remotely for the second year in a row, but I'm really happy to see so many folks able to join us out there in the internet. We have a really great presentation for you all this year. The team did an amazing job in typical PPL fashion, rising to a pretty complex, intensive project in just a week. This is the 9th year of PPL and the 9th year of our collaboration with the Continental Divide Research Learning Center. My name's Ariel Schnee. For those of you who don't know me, I'm joined here by Dr. Mike Childers, who's our faculty advisor for running. You guys will probably hear a couple of dings from my end as folks kind of join us here. Apologize for that. But really, without further ado, I'm gonna hand it off to the students in just a moment. We'll have a presentation for you all, and then followed by some Q&A. We're gonna ask you, because we do have, there's about 20 of us here today, so we're gonna ask you guys to submit your questions using the chat function, and I'll be moderating Q&A and hand it off to one of our student participants. So without further ado, here's Amber Scott, who is our PRSE fellow and the lead researcher for this project. Take it away, Amber.
Hello, as Ariel said, I am Amber Scott, and I am the current Public Lands History Center fellow. And I have been building off the foundation that Alex Miller, who is also here, he was the fellow last year, and he started this project, but here we are continuing it. So Parks as Pearls Learning 2021, a history of backcountry campsite management at Rocky Mountain National Park. Next slide.
This may not be enough if Doug's coming.
So, as I said, this project began actually in 2019, but implementation 2020 to 2021, emerged in collaboration with Sherry Yost, Scott Esser, and Barry Sweet. And our deliverables for this year, a timeline and written history of the Wilderness Office. This is building on the work that we did last year. So trying to contextualize the Wilderness Office and wilderness in Rocky Mountain National Park within the broader context of wilderness policy, nationally, locally. And this written history of the Wilderness Office is intended to be a resource for you all at the park for understanding just how the Wilderness Office came to be, what it means, what's happened over time. And then specifically, so this year we've transitioned more from a lot of last year's work was establishing that history. And so this year we've been focusing a lot more on individual backcountry campsites. And so we've been trying to create a database of changes to individual backcountry campsites. And so looking at tree removal, the silver arrowheads and signage and marking generally, camping areas versus tent pads, reactions to mountain pine beetle, bear activity and storage, waste management. So trying to trace these certain elements of backcountry campsites and their management throughout time. And a lot of that has actually involved figuring out who was doing what monitoring when. So we're still figuring that out a little bit. And then last year, we conducted an oral history with Barry Sweet, so we've been working on transcribing that. And then yesterday, we conducted an oral history with Jacob Seidel, and so we're also transcribing that. Next slide. So last year, 2020, our research questions revolved around like, how has the backcountry permitting system evolved? And how has the Wilderness Office been staffed over the years? And how visitors responded to changes. And so much more Wilderness Office focused and visitor responses. And this year we've transitioned more to looking on the ground and what it meant for the individual backcountry sites at Rocky Mountain National Park in the context of being backcountry and then wilderness. So how do backcountry campsites fit into the park's backcountry and wilderness management plans? How have these campsites been managed throughout the years? How have the management and monitoring systems evolved? And then even more specifically, how have individual backcountry campsites been added, named, removed, relocated, and tracking all of those attributes that I mentioned already. Next slide. So going forward in the presentation, we're going to talk a bit about methodology and sources, the themes that we've discovered thus far, go over that history of wilderness at the park, orders of backcountry campsites, changes to those campsites, little conclusion, some acknowledgments, and then a question and answer period. Next slide.
Sean Rose, and along with just a little bit of information about the sources that we used for this project. So first of all, we had a reading seminar where we went through a lot of secondary literature regarding wilderness. And then once we got to the park, as well as before actually too, we have Jill Wilson files from the Wilderness Office. These include correspondences and memos, several master plans that were created. And then we also have wilderness management plans. There are several of those. We have park literature, and then basically visitor studies that were done. Then we also went to the archive at Rocky Mountain, and so we went through natural resources management records, including records about the backcountry campsites that we were studying those changes for. And then lastly, we did several research interviews as well as oral history interview with Jacob Seidel. Those research interviews were done with Barry Sweet, Doug Parker, and Daniel Lawson, and then Kelly Cahill.
Okay, so some of the major themes that we found from our own research, as well as talking to park employees. So the first one was resource protection versus visitor enjoyment. You kind of have to find a balance between those two things. User behavior influencing management. So we found this a lot. So we found that some campsites that were developed actually were developed because they were previously camped there. People had previously camped there before they were actual sites. So that was an interesting theme that we had found in our own research. The manufacture of a wilderness aesthetic. So in the Wilderness Act of 1964, they used the word untrammeled by man. So that balance between untrammeled versus man-made campsites. And one of the examples that we found from Jacob's oral interview was that he would chop down trees, make the stump as low as possible, and then cover it with dirt to look like it had not been messed with by humans. And then navigating law, policy, and procedure, Rocky Mountain's different divisions and their respective roles in wilderness management. So the different divisions have varying roles, however, they work under the same mission of the National Park Service. And then fire recovery of the two fires that happened last summer. Obviously, the backcountry was heavily affected by those two fires. And then one other major thing that we found in talking with employees as well as our own research was waste management. That was actually a huge issue and a huge thing that the park has to deal with, and how it's handled across the different divisions in the park. Next slide, please.
So there's actually an extensive history of wilderness in Rocky Mountain National Park. We are going to give you the most brief timeline of those. There's a much larger timeline that we have created, but here's kind of the brief ideals and thoughts about wilderness in the park. And wilderness very much so changes over time with how it is constructed in the park and thought of by visitors as well as those who are working in the park. So in 1915, you have the creation of Rocky Mountain National Park. In 1916, the actual creation of the park. And then in that post-World War II society, you see so many more travelers and visitors coming to the park. People really wanting to camp, get outdoors, enjoy nature. And so after that, you also have the Wilderness Act of 1964. Well, since everyone is getting out and about in the 1960s to 1975, there is a 700% increase in backpacking. And so you have a lot more people using these outdoor spaces and kind of this construction of what wilderness is to them and what it means. And so by 1970, you actually have a consolidation of a backpacking permit that is created. And this is created off of the 1960 county's permit trial program. And so it's ever evolving. In 1975 and 1984, and in 1984, there's a backpack management plans as well, backcountry management plans, excuse me. And in 2001, you have the Wilderness Management Plan and Environmental Assessment. In 2009, Congress actually establishes the wilderness area in Rocky Mountain National Park. And then, as everyone knows, in 2015, there's an explosion of visitation in the park, and more people are coming. As a result, in 2020, there is now timed entry implication in the park for the front country. So you have even more of a limited amount of what is wilderness and the management of the system and creating this wilderness. So that's a very short timeline about these practices. And trust me, there's much more information. We just cannot fit in this presentation.
All right, so one of the things that a lot of us are curious about are the campsite origins, where they came from, who established them, why were they named what they're named. Basically, we found that a lot of the user established campsites are the ones that, you know, people had been coming to for years, had been camping there with family. Friends knew it was a good spot, so they came as well. So coming here for years, there was, you know, illegal campsites. Once the permitting system was implemented, people, yeah, they were illegal, but they were campsites because they were good ones. They were great, great location, flat level. Yet the park was concerned with the impact on the land that, you know, these campsites were having. You wanted to minimize that impact while still providing a good wilderness experience that we have been talking about to the people. So that was kind of how those campsites were established, as well as an increase in visitation also meant, you know, more people wanted to visit, to camp there, to enjoy the wildlife, hear the owls and all that. We also had the naming of the campsites. So the naming, we couldn't, it was difficult to find concrete info on like, this is why this was named what it is, Pine Ridge. But one thing that we did kind of see throughout was a lot of the places were named because of the natural features that were around them. For example, just bodies of water. And lastly, it was a little difficult to find specifics on individual campsites in our research. That doesn't mean that that doesn't exist. That just means that it is probably out there in the memories. It would require a lot more conversations, a lot more oral histories, a lot more time. It's out there. It just wasn't in any of the archives or files that we could find specifically for a lot of them.
Great. So we noticed a number of reasons why backcountry campsites have been created, moved, or decommissioned since the 1970s. Primary reason is, of course, for overuse, but overuse also has a number of factors. So before the transition away from backcountry fires, the biggest change in campsite evolution was from wood fires to stoves only. So the uptick in use kind of meant that there was less dead and downed wood for fires. So in order to not only preserve the integrity of the trees, but also to protect from fires spreading, a lot of campsites were changed from wood fires to stoves only. Another major reason that sites have been moved, decommissioned, is their proximity to trails. So diebacks in vegetation, the kind of expansion in trails, both of those led some sites to be visible from the terrain, or from the trail, sorry. And that sort of kind of goes against the wilderness ethic and the idea of solitude, of being away from other people, both while you're on the trail as maybe a day user and while you're backpacking as a backcountry user. Sites are also, of course, moved or decommissioned as a result of natural disasters. flood, fire, pine beetle infestation. A lot of the sites were lost in the fires from last year that haven't been able to be recommissioned yet. Another reason some sites have been closed due to their proximity to animal patterns, though much of that has kind of been mitigated with the introduction of bear-proof canisters. And finally, waste management is one of the most difficult aspects of wilderness campsite management. Issues of improper waste burial has led to the pollution of water sources. Privies are easily filled, especially with the high amount of people in the backcountry. And then when a campsite runs out of space to dig privy holes, it's more than likely needs to be commissioned. Next slide, please. All right, so our conclusion is essentially that wilderness management is a constantly evolving process. Technology and wilderness ethics have evolved over time towards a more resource preservation oriented ideal, with the goal of having the least impact on the park's natural resources. Because of this evolution, wilderness must be a collaborative process, with park divisions working together to ensure the production and enjoyment of the beauty of the park by people and animals, as well as preserving the ecosystem itself in the face of climate change and other large-scale impacts. Finally, we take a page from Barry Sweet in emphasizing the importance of fostering relationships with visitors and treating them like friends, not adversaries. While most national park staff might have a good understanding of why it is important to protect the backcountry and stay within the boundaries of your campsite, relaying that knowledge to visitors is key in getting them to understand the wilderness ethic. The public-facing personnel at the park are a crucial part of relaying this ethic onto backcountry users to ensure that there is an enjoyable experience for the visitors of today and for the visitors of 100 years from now. Next slide, please.
So, long list of acknowledgements here because so many people have been involved in this project. So first, Sherry Yost, Barry Sweet, Carissa Turner, Sherry Fedorchik, Camille Thorson, Kelly Cahill, Lisa Barron, and Scott Esser. Thank you for all of your assistance in planning this project, coming up with the ideas, coordinating everything. Kelly Cahill, special thanks to you for your assistance in locating these archival resources, for digitizing sources last year when we couldn't get to the archives, and just for your general insight into all things Rocky Mountain National Park and archives. Barry Sweet, Doug Parker, Daniel Lawson, and Jacob Seidel, thank you for your time and insight into the park's history and wilderness management, and for spending your couple hours with us yesterday. It's very fun to talk with you all. Thank you to Dr. Ruth Alexander for her insight and for conducting the oral history with Jacob Seidel yesterday. Thanks to Alex Miller for his leadership of PPL 2020 and for setting the foundation that we've worked off of this year. And thanks to the CSU Department of History, the Office of the Vice President of Research, and for the College of Liberal Arts for housing the PLHC and for granting permission to carry out this project. Thanks to the Henry Luce Foundation for funding this project. And finally, we, as the PPL student researcher team, we would like to thank everybody above and Michael Childers and Ariel Schnee for their guidance and assistance throughout this project. So thank you so much to all of you. Next slide. Question and answers. Sherry, I do not know what a short drop is. That was a random site change proposal I pulled from the records, and maybe somebody here from Trails or somebody could tell us what a short drop is. I don't know. And other questions, open, welcome.
All right, we have a question from Scott Esser. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. We have a question from Scott. Did this project change your perspective about wilderness values in the park?
It changed my perspective. I think I was surprised. I guess it was a more specific version of the wilderness ethic I mean, we talked a lot about wilderness as like the whole idea of wilderness or the Wilderness Act. And so there's broad like wilderness as an idea, more specific wilderness as what the Wilderness Act calls for. And then within that, it seemed like a lot of what we talked about yesterday was the wilderness aesthetic. And so in these management questions, how do, I think it was, sorry, Doug or Daniel, not sure, but the idea of managing something, like if we're doing our job right and we're managing this well, then it doesn't look like it's managed. So kind of managing your own impact out of the wilderness, even though it's a managed landscape. So this idea of an aesthetic in the signage, in where the campsites are, in what's there. And so that for me, that was a much more specific part of wilderness that I hadn't seen or understood before. But that's, anybody else?
Yeah, thank you, Amber. Let's take it over to Sean.
Yeah. The interview with Barry Sweet was really impactful, and just to hear his perspective over a career of managing the wilderness and like how he's literally thinking, 4,000 years in the future was something that he came back to several times during our interview. So for me, that was like really important to see how all of the legislation, is put into place on the ground, and like how Rocky is actually doing the management. So that was the biggest thing for me.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. That actually brings us really nicely into a question from Sherry Yost, who was one of the original authors of this project. So she asks, what do you think our biggest challenge with wilderness management over the next 5 years is? How about over the next 20? Let's take it over to Paige.
I think one of the most obvious and biggest ones is climate change, for sure. We talked about that a little bit with Barry Sweet the other day, and how he, what Sean just said, like he wants to make sure that the park is the same 4,000 years from now. And I think along with that is like the amount of visitors increasing over the years. Like we said earlier, in the 60s and 70s, there was a 700% increase just in backpackers, and population has grown immensely since then. So like we do have the timed entry system and the permitting system. However, as population grows and the popularity of the park increases, I think that's going to be, those are two issues that I could see in the next 5-20 years.
All right, Amber.
I would definitely echo Paige on the 20-year scale. Climate change, like we talked about that with Jacob yesterday, and just like the little things from like being out in the backcountry camping in the middle of summer, and like I don't need a puffy right now, like it's not supposed to be this warm out, or the like large fire obviously that happened last year, and just what does this mean for the park and climate change going forward, and communicating that with users and integrating it into management, just talking about like how the park and now like the NPS generally is large, bureaucratic, and operates on a reactive scale rather than a proactive scale. And so figuring out what that means in the context of climate change. On the 5-year scale, I think that we talked with Barry about how he's figuring out what retirement looks like and how to hand off. We used a lot of ship metaphors yesterday. So he's sailing his little ship right now and has this nimble software system that he's established over the years. And now you all are in the process of figuring out what that looks like with rec.gov. And thank goodness for Barry hanging around to figure out how to effectively hand off that transition. And what was it? It was like changing tides or something like that, or changing course. And it's not the end of an era, it's just the new one. And so figuring out how to like effectively pivot that for, again, managing the resource in a sustainable way and visitor safety. And I don't know, I feel like that transition is in great hands with Barry, but it's still going to be a challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. I'm actually going to field this next one myself. We have an audience member who is curious what we all saw as a direct impact from the timed entry system to wilderness impact. Anecdotally, they think that it has a direct impact, but we're wondering if we had any firm information on it. And all I can say is, we are historians, and it's going to take a really long time to assess impacts from our perspective of what the time entry system will actually, the changes that will actually, create on the ground. I think it's very clear from an anecdotal perspective that there will be massive changes as the result of actually getting a handle on visitor entry and visitor resource consumption, but it's really just too early to tell, I think. We also have a question from Corin Neidick, who is the resources chief at Rocky Mountain National Park. And Corin says, wilderness recreation has changed over time. What do you think some emerging uses of wilderness by recreationalists will be? JC.
Yeah, so I think one thing for me that I see in the future too is we've absolutely seen an uptick in social media use. People are Instagramming, they're TikToking, they are showing people what they're doing. And I think that there are a lot of individuals who have never been inclined to pursue this ideal of wilderness or this thought of wilderness. And all of a sudden they're seeing their friends out there, they're seeing what people are doing. And I know for me, this Parks to Portals learning really opened my eyes to this idea and to what recreation could look like for someone like me and what that would be doing. And so I think you're going to see a lot of people emerge into the field. So like novice backpackers and people who are like, oh, this is something I really want to try. And it might take on different shapes and different forms. But I think you're going to see a lot of people who traditionally don't have backgrounds in these spaces being very inclined to use these spaces.
Now let's take it over to Christy and then to Taylor.
I would also say, to go along with what JC said, kind of an increase of a diverse group of users, you know, having more BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the wilderness, and kind of seeing their, you know, they have very different relationships with wilderness. So kind of seeing how that plays out is going to be super fascinating. And I think it's just incredible as well. And with like easier access, not easier per se, but with a more kind of user-friendly platform, it's going to be a lot easier to have that kind of diverse group of users in the park.
I also think an issue that we're seeing, kind of echoing what JC said about social media, is also coming with it a little bit of a sense of entitlement. We're seeing that a little bit with the timed entry system, but I think also we're kind of seeing with like the availability of information, people coming into the park maybe and thinking they know everything there is to know about backpacking and they don't need a ranger to tell them what to do. And so we're kind of seeing these maybe certain people being like, oh, I have been backpacking all of my life. I don't need you to tell me that I, need to stick to this trail. I'm an expert. I know I'm not going to have an impact, or like, I feel like these are my woods. It's my right as an American to come to this national park when I want to. And so I think we have to, again, because of that sort of sense of entitlement, we really need to focus on that idea of fostering these relationships, and making people feel like friends. So they're more entitled to listen to staffers rather than seeing them as people in a position of authority who are only there to tell them what to do.
Great answer, Taylor and Christy. So we have a question from Alex. Alex noticed on the timeline that there's an uptick in use that occurred right around the park and NPS Centennial. And then I'm going to also editorialize the Estes Park Town Centennial was also around the same time. And he's wondering, was that due to the NPS Centennial campaign? And if so, how has the Wilderness Office anticipated future spikes in use? Go ahead, Paige.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because Barry mentioned that yesterday when we were talking to him. So, but yeah, he said there was a huge spike in visitors those years. And I think part of it too is like the rise of social media at the same time and like really good ad campaigns by the park and Estes Park. And I think now that they have realized that their campaigns were so successful, I bet they'll probably take that into like future if there's like a bicentennial in the future, and who knows what 50 years from now social media will be like. But yeah, I think with that, I think it sounded like Barry is kind of preparing the next generation of park employees to expect those upticks around those times, especially with the growth of social media at the same time, because that was only like a few years ago.
Very astute. Over to Amber.
Yeah, continue off of that. I think that there's, I mean, yes, there are ad campaigns. Barry did point directly to the Centennial Rockies 100th year anniversary and Estes, but he also talked a lot about how, yeah, these unanticipated outside changes have impacted park visitation and user behavior within the park. So talked about how originally the park had full control of what information came out of what information was published on Rocky Mountain National Park. So through the Conservancy, what campsites were listed in guidebooks. Oh, we don't want to mention that one. We'll take it out because we're in charge of the editing. And so then the internet happened, and all of a sudden there was no way for the park to control what information existed for public consumption on what was going on in the park. And so similarly, as Paige mentioned and JC also mentioned, just social media, that's been another unanticipated change that has impacted park or just visitation habits. And I think that, I don't know about ad campaigns. I don't know, does Rocky need to advertise itself anymore? I don't, but I think that there's a lot more that's unanticipated than anticipated. Maybe that's obvious, but those are some examples.
We have a question about access. What did you all learn about inclusive access to wilderness, especially in its use by people of color historically and/or currently?
I could answer that. I mean, to me, it was no surprise that a lot of the access was not meant for people of color and Black, Indigenous folks. So, you know, it was like a recurring trend that like it was a lot of white people and a lot of families as well, a lot of upper class as well. So it was interesting to see how, you know, we read some secondary sources that kind of explained why that was. And, you know, there was a lot of reasons. And one that has like really stuck with me has been the leave no trace, because I still see that impact today. How, you know, in order to access the park, of course, we want to minimize the impact. We don't want to litter. We don't want to do all these things. But also we don't want, we need the proper gear in order to go camping. We need, you know, a tent. We need a sleeping bag. We need all these things that are not, they're not cheap if they're going to be good for certain conditions, especially up on like Longs Peak or something like that. So it's something that's still happening today, and I can see how it impacts who visits the park today and why they visit it. And so that's kind of something that I learned. It doesn't mean that there's no changes going on and then there's no surge of diverse visitation. It's just what happened, you know, in the past is still, you know, impacting today and will continue to do so.
Thanks so much, Christy. Anybody else with thoughts on that question before we move on? All right. So our next question, I hear you saying that education has been a key to our success with wilderness management. I'm still trying to understand if visitors readily accepted changes to wilderness management over time, or was there pushback about certain changes? Was that tempered through education? Or was it just because past wilderness users understood and accepted that wilderness needed to be managed and that they were a part of that stewardship? Go ahead, Taylor.
So we found a little bit of, I mean, pushback is pretty natural. We saw in some like letters and things, people wrote to complain about changes, like, why is my favorite campsite closed? Or why are horses now allowed on this trail? I think it's pretty much what we came to the conclusion was, of course, people are going to complain, especially in the initial couple years after a change is implemented. People will continue to complain after that, but the bulk of it kind of comes in those early years. And people are a little bit more willing to accept the changes, especially if they are, you know, if they're explained to them, like they said, those conversations that Barry keeps talking about of having in the wilderness office of like, that he was explaining the transition between like throwing the your bag of food over a tree to doing the balance system to finally the bear canisters. And each one of those steps, you just need to explain to the people kind of why, There's always pushback, but I think in general, it seems that especially most backcountry users, I think they tend to come from a place of appreciation of nature, maybe more so than day users. So a lot of the people on the backcountry are going to be a little bit more willing to listen and a little bit more willing to implement those changes in their own patterns of behavior, so long as they are given a justifiable reason and a good reason. Like, oh, we do bear canisters, not just to protect you, but to protect the bears and protect the ecosystem itself. And I think having those conversations is crucial to getting people to understand changes.
Thoughts, anybody else? Just to kind of add to Taylor's excellent points there, and then I'll give it over to Amber. I also want to point out that the Backcountry office, as we learned, spends about 15 minutes with each permittee. And we think that a lot of education and a lot of relationship building can happen in those 15 minutes. But as Barry very rightly pointed out, it's a different problem entirely with front country users because of just the magnitude of people and also the pressures on park staff to get people through major points of contact very efficiently and very quickly. So that doesn't really leave a ton of time for much beyond the bare exchange of necessary information. So I'm going to hand it over to Amber now.
I was going to bring up that exact same thing. I think another element to wilderness user management or backcountry camper and campsite management that differs from day use visitor management is just the amount of regulation a backcountry user is already accustomed to. And so most people coming into the park are already, it is, I mean, I guess you say like, or was it because past wilderness users understood and accepted that it needed to be managed and they were part of the stewardship? I don't know if it was that explicit based on what we found in the records, but I think that there's more of an implicit and understood part. Not that there was like management happening, but that there are like broader ways of existing and like it's just regulated. And I think backcountry users were more used to that than front country users. And I think the other thing that we found that kind of echoes some things that you all are learning about the reservation system today is that a lot of this is education and is information, where the backcountry office would receive angry phone calls and angry letters, just like, I can't figure the system out, I'm so angry. And it was just because they couldn't figure out the system. And then as soon as they got the permit and as soon as they're in the backcountry and experiencing this less crowded experience, the backcountry people were like, this is great, I love the permitting system. And we've heard very similar things about the day use timed entry system, where I think Barry said yesterday that like it's a hate-love relationship where like he hates that he can't access the park, but once he gets in, he loves it because it's like going back to the mid-'80s in visitation. And so I think that just that it is that like thousands and tens of thousands of the backcountry permitting versus the millions of the day use visitors. And so yeah, I don't know how to bridge the education there, but the amount of education is a crucial part.
All right, guys. Alex is going to continue to push on this. He's wondering if there was any boost or preparation for the wilderness designation in like kind of the 2010s.
I didn't see anything about that. I guess I think that's less within the scope of what we've been working with. Like the Jim Wilson files, those go from the like 71, 72 through the mid 90s. And there's a whole box of stats that I haven't touched yet. So perhaps the answer lies in there. And that will be Christy's job to go through, so you can stay in touch with her.
Delegation is key to a successful enterprise. So we have a question from Scott. what was one of the most interesting items that you came across when you were pouring through documents in the archives? Why did you find that item so interesting? Paige.
I am glad to answer this one. I thought this was so interesting. So I found a bunch on, this may be gross, I'm sorry, but a bunch on Backcountry privies. And I found out that in the summer of 1979, this was like a report on backcountry toilets. And in the summer of 1978, about 1,300 pounds of human waste was taken per privy from Long's Peak. And I just, as like a day use person, that I go to the national parks, I don't really do backcountry stuff, but I just never think about it. And I thought that was really interesting because like, I feel like a lot of day use visitors don't think about that side of like wilderness management and like the park service. They just see the rangers at the front, at the gates and doing interpretation and education. They don't see that side of the management. And it was really interesting for me to then talk to the facilities management people and the backcountry management people at the park yesterday and like learn more about the things that they do. And I thought that was pretty cool to like read about it and then hear it from the people that actually work there.
Go ahead, JC.
Yeah, so for me, it was kind of an odd one, but we got to look through same campsites each year and see the changes in photographs about how they changed with reports of how they changed. And for me, in the 90s, the silver and metal arrowheads were massive. Like they were like on this 3-foot pole, like you would not miss it. And, you know, now visiting sites and they're much smaller. And so I think just changes of how the park handles, oh, this is what we're going to do here. We're going to keep signs looking this way to match our aesthetic or do this. I just think it's really interesting to know that the parks run much more deeper than the average visitor realizes. And they think about these things. How am I going to manage this trail this way so individuals can see this overlook, you know, that they've been making with social trails? How are we going to do this? There's just so much more information about decisions that I never realized existed. And I just respect park services much, much more than I did before we started this week.
Over to you, Taylor.
So reading through some of the complaints was really fun. Like some people were like, why are there horses here? Even though they're like designated stock trails and things like that. So that's kind of circles back to like people always complain, right? But one of the things that I thought was really fun, one of the things I was reading through was a catalog of kind of, I think it was like the number of campsites or something. And there was just this really fun paragraph that concluded it that said something along the lines of like whatever we decide to do here, however we input the data, we need to make sure that the people reading it in 50 years are able to understand it. And here I am, this was a document from the 1970s, and here I am 50 years later reading it. And it was very prescient, and it felt kind of like one of those moments where you're really communicating with the people of the past. And that was really special in a way that I didn't really think would be, or it was just kind of nice to stumble upon.
Anybody else? Gems from the archives? Go ahead, Amber.
This is I don't know if this is a gem, but having worked through so much of I've been working to digitize the Jim Wilson files for the last year, and I've been looking at a lot of these, just like the actual forms that people have been using throughout the years to like create site changes. And it used to be just like a note where it was like, in the Backcountry Management Committee meeting, it's like, well, we should probably do something about this campsite. And then it was formalized into a form. And then we had the opportunity to work with Kelly Cahill and look through some of the forms from Tara, the Wilderness Field Coordinator, and the amount of fields and like how it's so systematic now, where before it was just kind of like, oh, we see these things, and now it's like, do this rating, and I thought it was super interesting to see just how the actual form has changed and just how much more specific and sophisticated the wilderness backcountry management is now. Other interesting thing that I learned that is not from the archives, we were talking to Doug and Daniel yesterday, and I was like, well, okay, so facilities is involved, but then there's the Wilderness Field Office, and where's the difference? And Doug said that the reason that the Wilderness Field Office and crew manage the sites and the access trails is because the trails person who was in charge when the like asset management system was implemented like 15 or 20 years ago, the trails person was like, I don't want to put those access trails into the database, so the Wilderness Field Office can have those. And it's just, I think it's so funny how those little things can have big impacts and create these funny divisions and who manages what in a relatively, like in a landscape that looks the same to me or somebody from the outside.
You're right. It's very personal, I think. So we've been talking a little bit about kind of the micro level of things that you guys noticed from the records. Corinne is going to ask you guys to like tap into your inner Mark Fiji and think really, really big and expansively. So she says, in regards to the comment of keeping wilderness the same, with climate change, we know that that's not a realistic goal. How do you see management addressing accelerated environmental change in wilderness?
So we talked to this a little bit with people we talked to yesterday. What we kind of learned is that the national park is very reactive. That's a little bit more because of budget. It also comes from just kind of a federal government sort of standpoint and how the government sort of just operates in the United States. So in terms of management addressing environmental change, who really knows? I think the change kind of has to happen first, and then the Park Service and the federal government are going to have to react to it, essentially. It's not that the people in the park don't have a lot of forethought. It's just kind of at the like higher levels of administration. It's really hard to convince people, really hard to convince Congress that projects need to be done without showing evidence of something already occurring. Like, you know, it's hard to maybe get money for fire prevention unless there's an actual fire and that sort of thing. So I wouldn't say that I see it going well.
Thanks very much for your candor, Taylor. We appreciate it. Anybody else thoughts about responses to environmental change as the result of global climate change? Go ahead, Amber.
I guess this is not, I don't know, this is about accelerated environmental change and climate change, but it's also about any changes in the park and management generally. Is there's just, I mean, Barry was talking all about divisions and how the different divisions in the park, how they're both a strength and a weakness, and how you have expertise, you have specialty, but if you do not talk between the silos, if you do not break the silos, if you do not work together, then it all falls apart. If you don't have those relationships between each other and with the visitors, it all falls apart. And then we kind of heard that echoed throughout the day. And concluding with Jacob, where Jacob is a Wilderness Field Crew lead, and we heard from Doug Parker, who said, oh yeah, I communicate with Tara all the time. And so there's this upper level communication across the different divisions. But then Jacob said that he doesn't really get any of that, and he doesn't get to interact with many other people, and they're just over at the Bighorn Ranger Station doing their thing, and there's just not much talking for him as he experiences it between the divisions. And so I think for environmental, like just trying to be more proactive and even like being better in reactions, I think that collaboration and working between the divisions, because you all are so friggin' smart and you know so much about the park, and using that better. And I know you don't have very much time, and talking takes time, but like, I don't know. I think that that's something very important for us all in assessing climate change. And
good point, Amber. Taylor, do you have a thought? Nope. Okay. Just leaning in. So this actually might be a good question for Mike. Sherry says that it would be interesting to think about wilderness users in Rocky Mountain National Park versus across the border wilderness users in the U.S. Forest Service, where wilderness is a lot less regulated in places. Mike, do you have any thoughts about a compare and contrast treatment of this issue?
Boy, good question. Initial thoughts, yeah, I mean, the scripted spaces, they're much more scripted within the national parks versus out in the U.S. Forest Service. And obviously, we all know there's reasons for that in terms of personnel and popularity and each agency's mandate. I would think that within the park, because it is a park, and with anytime you put an arrowhead on something, it becomes something a little bit more desirable, special, I would say, that you're going to have a much different sort of interaction, visitor interaction with these with backcountry or wilderness campsites than inside the park than within Forest Service land. At the same time, one of the things that the students' research has come out on the last couple of years over this particular topic is that the backcountry and wilderness users typically have already kind of bought into this wilderness ethic. And so as a user group, they're fairly uniform in the idea of leave no trace or why they're going to the backcountry. They're kind of monolithic. They're largely, until very recently in demographics, male, white, and educated. So that then kind of suggests that they might be interacting with wilderness on the Forest Service or BLM in a similar way as the Park Service in that regard. It's not as scripted. The trails may be not as well maintained, but they are seeing these sorts of landscapes in a similar way. So that's a pretty good stab at a question, at an answer, I suppose, hopefully, for it.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. For those of you who are curious, Mike has an admin history of the U.S. Forest Service coming out in the next few years. So be on the lookout for an updated administrative history that might contemplate some of those same issues. Does anybody else have any thoughts? Maybe items that you gleaned from our oral histories that might suggest differences between sort of wilderness management and the Forest Service versus the national parks? Okay, hearing none. Oh, Amber, thank you.
I think we heard personnel, just how Rocky is lucky to have so many trails people and so many people out in the wilderness doing management. And then the Forest Service has 4 people for the entirety of the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest, and personnel.
Yeah, that's a good point. Personnel is definitely different. And acreages are different too. The Forest Service obviously has much more land to administer. You know, we are coming in on time here. Oh, we got another question. Okay, so Stephen is asking, in researching the names of campgrounds, trails, etc., is there anything y'all came across in naming of spaces that discouraged BIPOC visitation? Perhaps either by differing meanings of words within a historical context or by association with some historical figure. Inversely, is there anything now that you can speak to that will assist us in creating a more diverse backcountry? Taylor.
I'm not going to speak to all of this because I don't have quite as thorough of an understanding. But we did have a conversation about specifically the naming of places and how there are a lot of peaks, places, campsites, not just in Rocky Mountain, but throughout the West and throughout, in public land, not on public land, that are named after, colonizers essentially, and people who, were essential in the Indian genocide of the West. And so that sort of, that right there is, I think, I've read some articles about how the difficulty of basically these lands that can be sacred, but they wear the name of a colonizer, right? Like we think beyond Rocky Mountain, we think of like the Black Hills and Mount Rushmore and like that particular thing. So I think naming things is probably the easiest way to try to spark more inclusion. But I'm not really sure on the rest. I think a lot of it just comes down to education, but I think Christy has a lot more ideas about that than I do.
Absolutely. Over to you, Christy.
Yeah, something yeah, not necessarily the naming again of the trails. At least I couldn't come across any. Of course, I didn't know the history of any of the names. But I think something that I thought about a lot was kind of how the Wilderness Act of 1964 kind of romanticizes the idea of wilderness. And we kind of see that, you know, I was able to pick that up. Not that it's a bad thing, but I was able to pick that up with the people we talked to and kind of reading through the archives and all this. And it was frustrating because it lacks the recognition of, you know, the damage and the hurt that it has caused a lot of Indigenous people, Black people, as well through slavery, how wilderness was not only a place to escape all the hurt that was being, you know, done to them, but also it was a place where it was scary to be at, because if you're out there caught with a bunch of white people around, that's dangerous, it's scary. So it was something that I thought about a lot, and how kind of the romanticization of the wilderness itself as a concept, as an ideal, just, I think it does discourage a lot of BIPOC people. It also brings them in. I think now we kind of see how it's kind of changing and bringing in a lot of those diverse groups of people. But yeah, that's kind of, I'm just trying to read through the rest of the question. But I think, yeah, just recognizing, you know, the kind of, what's it called? Kind of like the conflicts that there are in National Park Service, its creation, you know, the forced removal of Indigenous people from their own land. I think recognizing that is going to be so important in creating a more diverse background and more diverse park that we have today. Just keeping that at like the forefront of interpretation, of like management as well, law enforcement in the parks and how that impacts different people as well. So that was kind of, sorry, that's kind of like scattered all over, but those are kind of my thoughts on that.
Over to you, Taylor.
Just a final thought also, I think diversity in hiring practices is really important too in introducing other perspectives, especially of BIPOC people and their ideas of land management, and being able to put that in with this kind of very Western idea of wilderness. And I think that's really essential. I also kind of just going back to the naming thing real quick, I was reminded of a few years back, Yosemite was sued by the tribes in the nearby areas, and they were forced to rename a lot of their trails, and the famous Yosemite Lodge and all of that now bear the names of like the native creeks, the indigenous, the names that the indigenous people gave the creeks and things like that in the surrounding areas. I think that's a good first step, but I think ultimately what it does come down to is making sure that include, like, not only are should the National Park Service and the federal government encourage people of color to apply, but they need to go out and actively search and support people to pursue these sort of paths that lead them to the National Park Service and land management, where it's, instead of it being kind of like a passive, let the people of color come to us, the federal government really needs to go and be more proactive in that way.
Excellent point. I'd also like to counterbalance kind of the critique that historians have levied at the national parks as being a very white enterprise, with the fact that we've been exposed to a lot of great endeavors by Rocky Mountain National Park at integrating people of color into the backcountry and into the park more generally. I mean, the outreach that was going on to the Estes Park Hispanic community through, I think, interpretation has been huge. We know that a scholar out of CU Boulder, Brooke Neely, is currently working with the Ute and the park to develop curriculum and interpretation that supports kind of Indigenous history within the park. So there's a lot of really great beginnings to build from as we start thinking about, okay, great, we've kind of done a lot of relationship building. How do we get these people into the backcountry in a way that they feel safe, and that their experience can be directed more and more by people who look like them? I think that's going to be huge, but you know, credit where credit is due. It takes a big lift to acknowledge and deal with this history, particularly in a natural park like Rocky. So thank you for that question. any final thoughts before we sign off here? I do want to, before we close, say a huge thank you. We actually have 4 of the 5 division chiefs from Rocky with us today. And I really appreciate such a robust question and answer. It's really helped me think through some of the issues that we've encountered and get a new perspective on this work. It's really exciting. All right, well, thank you all so much for attending. We have been recording, and if I can figure out Zoom, I will make this available to everyone who wanted to come here today but wasn't able to join us synchronously. Again, thank you all so much for being here today.